The world is reckoning with the biggest oil supply disruption in history, one that has sent energy prices soaring, rattled stock markets, and exposed the deep vulnerabilities of economies still hooked on fossil fuels. But will these crises fuel a change in global economic structures? This week on UpFront, I'll ask one of the world's most influential economic thinkers, the founding director of University College London's Institute for Innovation and Purpose, Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana Mazzucato, thank you for joining us on UpFront.
Thank you so much. Very happy to be here.
So since the war on Iran began, we've seen oil prices averaging above $100 a barrel last month. Global markets are rattled. The cost of borrowing has gone up for governments everywhere. But let's talk about everyday people. If somebody's trying to fill up their tank in Cleveland or pay electricity in London, buy fuel in Nairobi, what are they going through at this moment?
Sure. Well, what we see, by the way, with the Iran war is what we also saw with COVID, when you'll remember that the supply chains globally were affected, what we saw already with the Ukraine war, but even 6 months before the war in Ukraine, we had a huge energy shock and, gas prices were rising. And what's interesting is that not every country is affected in the same way. It's those countries who have actually invested in having a more diversified a supply of energy that are actually more resilient. So this question you're asking, the answer is not the same in every country. Look at Spain. Spain has actually taken for years now very active, proactive stances on how to diversify their energy so they're not over-reliant on these very fossil fuels that now are stuck at the strait. But also the question is who's benefiting. Some are hurting. Most people are hurting, those who have to pay these higher prices, of course, to fill their cars. However, the top 1% is benefiting from what's happening globally. So even in 2022, when we had a very large energy shock, the largest fossil fuel companies in the US made $400 billion, of which the top 1% actually benefited from that because of how finance is structured. Because you'll remember that, for every company there's shareholders. So who owns the shares in these companies? Who's benefiting and who's hurting? And that question should always be asked. Otherwise, we're acting as though we're all in it together, but it's not true. Mm-hmm. Every time there's a price change, right? Anytime there's volatility in prices of any of these commodities, lots of money is being made.
In fact, I read a very staggering statistic from The Guardian that the top 100 oil and gas companies actually profited about, $30 million US dollars per hour since this war began in the month of this war.
Yes. And also every time Trump makes an announcement, the question is who might have had some insider information about those announcements just before, because there's lots of trades happening every time social media posts are going out.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but let's just talk about the International Energy Agency calls this the largest oil supply disruption in history. And Oxford Economics warns that this could be one of the worst global economic downturns in 40 years. And the United Nations is actually warning that 32 million people could be pushed into poverty. So the impact of this war has been absolutely devastating. Is this a temporary shock, or are we seeing the reshaping of the global economy?
Well, again, this war is absolutely terrible, both in terms of the fact that it didn't have to happen, but also its effects. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it also has happened in a period where there's lots of really other bad things happening. 2 billion people in the world still don't have access to safe drinking water. That's insane in the 21st century. 1,000 children under the age of 5 die every single day due to that unsafe drinking water. And in fact, we're here today in Washington, D.C., where yesterday Ajay Banga at the World Bank talked about the World Bank's own mission around water to make it safer. They also have the Mission 300 to get 400 million people in Africa to have electricity that currently don't have electricity. But the question is how we do these things. If we continue to think that policy is just about doing good for people without changing the underlying economics. So as an economist, I'm really focusing a lot on the problematic relationship we've had with kind of defunct, I would call it, economic theory that has informed inertial policies, right? If we think that the role of the state is just to fix market failures, to put bandages here and there, instead of to actively shape a different type of economy that's good for people and planet, by design, we will always be on the back foot. You can't have, during COVID, vaccine nationalism, because we're all affected together. You can't have climate nationalism, water nationalism, biodiversity nationalism. This Artemis, these astronauts who took those amazing pictures of Earth, from the moon, that was extraordinary. And if you heard what they said, that we're all one humanity, that sounds great. And it gave me, shivers when they said it. But that's not how we're acting right now. And it was such a, it's interesting in this moment where there's, geopolitical tensions to a degree that we haven't had for a very long time since the Cold War, where we have mass suffering in terms of inequality, again, water, climate, the symptoms of climate change that we have globally. It's not true that we're acting as one. And that would have been such a great call to action right now to not only stop the war, but to really reflect our solutions in a global way.
You mentioned the World Bank. You are here in Washington for the World Bank IMF spring meetings. You just presented a paper, and you actually say this, that the World Bank has failed in its mission. What's your core message then to these multilateral institutions, and what can they change now? What do they need to do?
So the World Bank, I think, failed in the past, as did the IMF, because, for example, when they provided loans to developing countries, these were loans that were conditional on certain types of structural reforms, but also reductions in the deficit, as though that was just this number that had to fall, as opposed to here's loans that will help you invest, that will help you spend, that will help you strengthen your health systems, your infrastructure, your innovation policy that should be targeted to actually solve, problems on the ground. And I do think, however, now the World Bank is on a different trajectory. The current president, Ajay Banga, is trying not to transform it, and they have, for example, some very ambitious policies, which I think are progress. They're not failing. We shouldn't just judge, the bank as though it's, good or bad. They're trying to transform it. But what I've been saying is that, for example, with their Mission 300, again, electrifying, actually now it's 400 million people in Africa, unless that's underpinned with a different way to think about finance, so that it's not a financial gap, as though there's a hole that you just have to throw money into, but that we really think about the structure of finance. So we need more patient, long-term finance. So what public banks should be doing when they provide loans to companies is making sure that the benefits, the profits that are then generated, are reinvested back into the economy and not extracted out into just the financial sector. So what we actually need is for the World Bank to really rethink the whole ecosystem, or help to rethink the ecosystem of these multilateral development banks and the national banks to work together so that the sum is bigger than the parts. Otherwise, you just have this kind of project funding, and it sounds good, a water project here, a climate project there, an infrastructure project, but we're not actually seeing transformation. We're not really reducing inequality. We're not getting more resilient energy supply chains. So as soon as we have an energy shock, a country that's over-reliant on one form of energy will, sink faster. And so that idea of really starting with the question, what's to be done? And then making sure the finance is structured to help make that happen. That's about outcomes-oriented finance. And I wrote a book recently called Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, where I talk about what a mission-oriented financial structure would look like. But that requires, in the first instance, a very different public-private relationship. And I often joke that biologists are more rigorous than economists when we talk about partnership. Partnerships can be bad partnerships, and biologists look at ecosystems, and they don't just use it as like a neutral, normative word. They will differentiate whether an ecosystem is predatory, parasitic, symbiotic, mutualistic, and what we need in the global order, but also at the national level. I'm from Italy, you're from South Africa, and I'm sure we can both reflect on our own countries that the relationship between the state and business is often parasitic. We socialize risks, privatize rewards. There's not enough conditionality on businesses, not only to reinvest the profits, as I said, but to treat workers better, improve working conditions, use energy efficient supply chains, instead of just money passing from one hand to another.
So we are living in this era of austerity, and we know that the Trump administration has been withdrawing from multilateral institutions institutions, including those that are at the forefront of saving lives, like the World Health Organization. And then you also have European governments that are under pressure to slash expenditure at the same time. And you touched on this when you talked about the cost of servicing debt for global South countries, that inequality there. So that has resulted in erosion of faith across the global South, erosion of faith in multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. You said that the World Bank hasn't completely failed, and you mentioned a couple of things that ought to be done. Are decision makers listening?
So first of all, it's not just the problem with the World Bank. It is, again, how we have structured our national policies, right? Governments nationally have failed to deliver for their own people. There's no point in just showing up in places like Davos at the World Economic Forum, or this week at the spring meetings, or at the COP conferences where they discuss climate solutions, if then we don't practice what we preach, right? So I'm very interested in local policies as well, and to show how we can actually then scale better solutions. So for example, if we're interested in hunger and the issues around hunger or climate, or life below water in terms of what's happening inside our oceans. This great documentary just made by David Attenborough, who just shows all these animals, choking on the plastic that we're throwing into our seas. Unless we actually show that we can structure our own governments and our own businesses in a different way and create, as I mentioned before, a mission-oriented partnership, then why should people believe? Why should they have trust in their governments? And this is what we see globally. Many people resorting, unfortunately, to voting for certain parties that then just have a quick, if you want, answer. Blame the immigrants, or blame
like
in Europe. Blame, exactly.
Energy.
Whether it was Brexit, whether it's blaming immigrants in different parts of the world, whether it's often blaming those who ultimately are the most vulnerable. I mean, this is the irony, that we're blaming those who actually have been suffering the most, as opposed to the underlying structures that are causing these problems. So I'm interested in things like, I'm an Arsenal supporter, and I hope that Arsenal wins the Premier League.
I am too.
So, are
Yes.
you? Okay, let's talk. Wait, okay, let's not actually go there. We'll start, going off on tangents. But Arsenal will win the Premier League, and maybe even the Champions. Anyway, but I was going to mention Marcus Rashford, who played for Manchester United. Now he's playing for Barcelona, and he did something so important during COVID. He said, I would never have become a footballer had I not had a free school meal, right? So just imagine that. If now during the World Cup, we had all the footballers in the world saying, we need to actually invest in our welfare policy so everyone can flourish. And we, or I, would not have become a footballer had I not had access to breakfast at school and lunch at school. And what does that mean, right? For actually then saying, okay, let's make sure that every child in a country, especially, but not only in global South countries. He was talking about one of the richest countries in the world, in the United Kingdom, where there is, by the way, so much inequality. There's starvation in many parts of the United Kingdom. So imagine if we actually had policies that meant something for people, that every child has access to healthy, tasty, so they actually eat it, and sustainable school lunch. Sustainable, very important, so that these climate strategies aren't just, blah, 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 but they're grounded in the everyday, which then would require governments to work in that kind of situation room kind of way that we only do with wars, but we should normalize that. Department of Health, Department of Agriculture, Department of Environment, Department of Economy, working together to deliver a policy that matters to people, that they can actually say yes or no, did they receive it? The reason I wrote Mission Economy is that to go to the moon and back in a short amount of time, which is the Apollo mission, the first thing they did was had to change how government works. They changed procurement from being just cost plus, which is always a race to the bottom. Ketchup is a vegetable, is what Reagan said, in order to reduce the cost of school meals, right? Instead of what I just said before. They changed procurement to be mission-oriented, outcomes-oriented, to find solutions to what the astronauts found themselves requiring. Better ways to go to the bathroom in the lunar module, what would they eat, what would they wear, and solutions to those problems happen through public-private partnerships, which got us camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, home insulation, software. So we shouldn't believe the hype, the Trump and the Elon Musk hype where they said empathy is for wimps. We should start with the goals that will actually help solve problems on the ground and find solutions to those problems through innovation, through investment, through industrial strategies that are grounded on good public-private partnerships. And what's interesting is if we do it well, growth follows. Yes. Growth isn't the mission. Growth is the outcome if we can stimulate investment. And I say this in an era in capitalism where the profit share of global income is at a very high level, but the investment share isn't. So the labor share is low, the profit share is high, but these profits are not being invested. They're not actually being used for innovation, for investment, for finding solutions on the ground. So this requires active and ambitious governments nationally, but also with our multilateral organizations, to stop just talking in this abstract way and to really find solutions that matter. And maybe people will start to trust governments again.
So let's just talk about how the world is reorganizing itself as a result of this war. During this war, Iran has been using the Strait of Hormuz as leverage. In fact, they've introduced toll booths for select vessels and reportedly charged transit fees, not in US dollars, but in Chinese yuan. We've seen countries scrambling to cut a deal with Iran, to negotiate directly with Iran. So my question is this crisis accelerating a shift away from dollar dominance?
So I actually wrote a piece last September in Foreign Affairs about this, that the BRICS countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and other countries that have joined that coalition, are actually starting to present a very different type of model. Take Russia out of the picture just for a minute, but definitely Brazil and South Africa, for example, when they currently hosted both the G20, but also the COP in Brazil, the language, this idea of a coalition of the willing, right? And we also see this now with Spain, with President Sanchez talking in a very different way about the war and why it shouldn't have happened in the first place, about national austerity plans that do not help people. It actually costs more to the state to pick up the pieces afterwards because of health costs when people aren't actually being taken care of at source, for example. He also took a very important stance on Gaza. So there are different leaders out there that are not just talking to camera, but are trying to also collaborate and find coalitions together. And actually this weekend, President Sanchez is hosting a global progressive mobilization. I'll be flying out tonight to go to Spain for that. And we see President Lula from Brazil, President Sanchez in Spain, Mia Mottley, who I think is one of the most ambitious leaders in the world, the Prime Minister of Barbados, meeting to really create a different narrative framing, I would argue theory. That's what we also need from the economists, a different theory of how the economy works, but also very different practice, and doing it together. And unless we have a coalition of the willing, then we will still, at best have leaders, talking the good talk, but we won't show that we can do things differently.
So this kind of predatory way of doing business is just off. But I think it speaks then to your new book that is coming up later in the year. You've talked about a mission-focused, mission-oriented business, but the book is called The Common Good Economy, A New Compass. It's an interesting phrase, common good. It conjures up benevolence, a shared humanity. But it can mean different things to different people. How do you define it economically and ensure that it is not captured by the powerful?
Exactly. So, the reason I've written the book, which is coming out in June in the UK, in the US in September, and it's coming out in many different languages, is precisely what you just said. It's so easy to talk about good, but are we actually delivering it? And the answer is no. We're in fact going backwards in most of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we know from our own countries inequality is rising and so on. And so how do we actually create a framework that holds ourselves accountable when we talk about good? And the book begins by criticizing how economists talk about good. When we talk about the public good, it sounds good, two words, one of which is good. It's just a correction for something the private sector is not doing. So this idea that we're just fixing market failures, and when it's an area that we would like the private sector to be investing in, but they don't, we expect government to fill the gap. And so I begin by saying the common good is not a correction, it's an objective, like a moonshot. However, what really matters is the how we reach it. So the how we work together, how capital and labor work together, how public and private, how public and citizens matters as much as what we're trying to do. And so I lean more on political philosophy. So Aristotle, for example, talked about the telos, the goal, and the polis, not the police, the polis, the community, right? So how do we actually form community? How do we really start looking at all contracts? So the common good economy, I break the compass down into 5 elements. The first is purpose and directionality. Let's really talk about what we're trying to do on the ground, like the school meal example. Second, co-creation. What these missions are need to be outcomes of participatory discussion. For the moon landing, it didn't really matter if it was technocratic, but for these earthly missions, we really need participation of people who are most affected also by the policies. And I used to talk quite a bit with Pope Francis, and he wrote in his encyclicals and the Laudato Si that the common good had to be based on the preferential option for the poor, which comes from Catholic social thought, which means to make sure that every policy is judged by how it will affect the most vulnerable the most, but also the principle of subsidiarity, which meant it has to be also designed at a very local level. Third, sharing knowledge. Fourth, sharing rewards. So we stopped doing what we did in Silicon Valley, where everything in your iPhone was publicly financed, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, and yet the benefits, we know where they've gone, to these very large trillion-dollar earning companies on the back of public investment. And the fifth, transparency and accountability. Again, think of our own countries where there's lots of lack of transparency, and this is also a key reason why people lose faith in what's happening, because you don't even know who owns what and why, who's doing what and why.
We talked about this earlier, about who's benefiting the most from this war, the top 100 oil and gas companies, money that's leaving the pockets of ordinary citizens into these shareholders. But I wonder whether this knowledge that this war has been lucrative for some, the tech architecture lucrative for some. You actually wrote then that this energy crisis shows us that it's time for a new green industrial strategy. Tell us about that.
Sure. And, I actually talk about green growth because industrial strategy ultimately, we're talking about capitalism, right? So industry matters, business matters. How do you get business also to rethink its own governance? When I talked about this huge amount of money that's just going to buying back shares, that's due to a corporate governance strategy, which is maximizing shareholder value. So what does it mean to maximize stakeholder value? The value that is both created by a much wider group of people, including labor, including indigenous communities, for example, in the Amazon, that have huge amounts of knowledge about how to preserve biodiversity, but their own knowledge is not being brought to the table in the design, for example, of the Amazon Fund, which sounds great, but who has actually both created it and who's benefiting? We need to have much more, as I said, participatory structures. But the idea of having green growth, and by the way, it's not because I think we need green growth, it's the planet. Just, like we are expanding what they call the planetary boundaries. And the issue is, what does it mean to also just go beyond talking about energy, but to really talk about, green cement, green steel, different transport structures. So it's not about transport, but sustainable mobility. How do we bring these goals to the center of an industrial strategy, which ultimately will catalyze business investment? And what is growth but a function of investment? So we're solving both a climate issue, but also fostering growth. And this is why I often argue to politicians, don't talk about growth, talk about the problems and make sure you use your industrial strategy to foster solutions to those problems. And lo and behold, growth follows, as long as the solutions are driven by innovation.
Last question. We've spoken about the Iran war, energy crisis, market shocks, and all of that. And you are talking about a mission-oriented approach. Do these crises make it harder to implement that mission-oriented approach?
No, I think the crises, interestingly, bring the urgency back. And it's not surprising that we have mission-oriented approaches in times of war. Again, going to the moon and back in a short amount of time was during the Cold War, where the U.S. was, really at war, during the Cold War with Russia, and there, the whole Sputnik moment. Also during COVID, where we were, started to have again departments of health and energy and military and finance and education in the room together, because they had to work together to solve the problems that the countries were facing. So when we have periods of urgency and crisis, governments often wake up. But the problem is they then fall back asleep, as we saw post-COVID, where we no longer had the kinds of investments in our health services and health systems that we really should have been continuing to have in order to be more resilient next time around. So hopefully this energy crisis will actually make governments realize that they have to become more resilient to not depend on fossil fuels, to have that more renewable energy mix in their energy sources. However, that requires leadership. And this is where, again, this event that's happening this weekend, this global progressive mobilization by those leaders who do talk about the need to improve public services, public housing, sustainability, so we are breathing good air, water for all. This moment is very, very important to allow the leaders who do care about a more progressive way to structure our economies to have a voice together and to also build that trust back with citizens, as you rightly say, have lost that trust.
Mariana Mazzucato, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront.
Thank you.